In the sleepy town of Dover, Pennsylvania, life had always been predictable. People knew their neighbors. Schools were tight-knit, and crime rarely went beyond minor infractions. But that peaceful routine was shattered when the lifeless body of Stephen Porter, a popular high school history teacher, was found in his quiet suburban home. It was Elena Diaz, Stephen's neighbor, who first noticed something amiss. Usually, Stephen was the first one to leave in the mornings, but his car remained parked in the driveway well past noon. Concerned, Elena knocked on his door, but received no response. She peeked through the window and saw Stephen motionless on the floor of his living room. Panic set in, and she immediately called the police. The discovery of Stephen's body marked the beginning of a chilling investigation, one that would expose a tangled web of secrets, betrayals, and deadly obsessions. An affair gone terribly wrong. Stephen Porter, 34 years old, was a beloved figure at Dover High School. His passion for history and dedication to his students had earned him a reputation as one of the best teachers in the district. He was known for staying after school to help students with projects, organizing field trips to historic sites, and even tutoring students one-on-one when they struggled academically. But while Stephen's professional life seemed flawless, his personal life was far more complicated. Stephen had always been a private man. He wasn't married, and though he had plenty of friends, few knew much about his romantic life. Some speculated that Stephen was single by choice, focused on his career. Others whispered rumors about his sexuality, rumors that Stephen neither confirmed nor denied. He kept his personal life locked away, careful to maintain his reputation as a respectable teacher. Despite his charm and good looks, Stephen had always been somewhat of a loner. Colleagues invited him out for drinks or social gatherings, but he often declined, preferring to spend his free time at home. What few people knew, however, was that Stephen's home was the setting for something far darker, a secret relationship that would soon come to light. Stephen had taken a special interest in one of his students, Evan Michaels, a bright but troubled 18-year-old senior. At first, their relationship seemed innocent enough. Stephen had offered to tutor Evan after school, helping him with his college applications and preparing him for upcoming exams. But as the months passed, their relationship grew closer, blurring the lines between teacher and student. Evan Michaels was one of Dover High's most promising students, a standout on the debate team. He had a sharp mind and a natural charisma that made him popular with his teachers and peers. But Evan's home life was far from ideal. His parents had divorced when he was young, and his relationship with his father had always been strained. At school, he kept up a confident facade, but inside, he was struggling. It was during his junior year that Evan first connected with Stephen Porter. Stephen had noticed Evan's potential and offered to help him with his studies, particularly with his history coursework. At first, their meetings were strictly academic, taking place in Stephen's classroom after school. But as the months passed, their tutoring sessions became more frequent, eventually moving to Stephen's house. Evan admired Stephen. He looked up to him as a mentor, someone who believed in him when others didn't. But the relationship soon became more than just a student-teacher bond. One evening, after a particularly long study session, Stephen poured them both a glass of wine. It felt like a small act of rebellion to Evan. He was underage, after all. But Stephen reassured him that it was fine. "You're practically an adult," Stephen said with a smile. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere between them shifted. Stephen's compliments about Evan's intelligence and potential turned more personal. He told Evan how special he was and how much he enjoyed their time together. Before long, the conversation became physical. It started with a touch, just a hand on the shoulder, nothing more. But soon, it became clear that Stephen wanted something more. Evan was conflicted. On one hand, he admired Stephen and craved the attention he gave him. But on the other, he knew that what they were doing was wrong. Still, Stephen's words made him feel important, valued in a way that he hadn't felt before. And so, despite his reservations, Evan allowed the relationship to continue. Their affair became a carefully guarded secret. Evan would stay late at Stephen's house under the pretense of working on school projects. But the reality was far different. The relationship grew more intense, with late-night meetings, secretive texts, and the constant thrill of something forbidden. But as time went on, Evan began to feel a growing sense of unease. Stephen's attention wasn't always on him. There were other students, other young men, who seemed to capture Stephen's interest. Evan had noticed the way Stephen talked to them, the same way he had once talked to him. The jealousy gnawed at Evan, and he became increasingly possessive, demanding more of Stephen's time and attention. He said I was special, Evan would later tell the detectives, his voice trembling with anger. But he was seeing others behind my back. I wasn't the only one. The affair, once a source of excitement for Evan, had turned toxic. Stephen's charm, once so alluring, now felt suffocating. Evan's emotions were in turmoil, caught between his desire for Stephen and his growing resentment toward him. The situation was a powder keg, ready to explode. And on the night of Stephen's death, it did. The investigation into Stephen Porter's death took a sudden and dramatic turn when detectives Sarah Matthews and Jason Hall discovered that his relationship with Evan Michaels had been far more than academic. The rumors about Stephen's personal life had always been there, but no one had suspected just how deep the secrets ran. Evan, now a prime suspect, was brought in for questioning. He sat in the small interrogation room, his hands trembling and his eyes red from tears. At first, he denied any involvement in Stephen's death. He admitted that they had been close, that Stephen had mentored him, but he insisted that their relationship had been strictly professional. However, as the hours wore on, Evan's story began to unravel. The detectives, skilled in reading body language and subtle cues, pressed harder. We know there was more to your relationship than just schoolwork, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. You need to tell us the truth. Evan's composure cracked. He broke down in tears, confessing everything: the late-night meetings, the secret texts, the affair that had consumed him. I loved him, Evan sobbed. I thought he loved me too. But then I found out about the others. He was seeing other students behind my back. The detectives exchanged a glance. This was the break they had been waiting for. Evan's confession gave them a motive, a deadly combination of love, jealousy, and betrayal. As they dug deeper into Stephen's life, more disturbing details emerged. Stephen had been involved with several young men at the school, all of them students, and all drawn in by his charm and charisma. He had used his position of authority to manipulate these vulnerable young men, making them feel special only to discard them when he grew bored. One of the students, Brian Lewis, came forward, admitting that he had been involved with Stephen as well. It started with tutoring, Brian said. He helped me with my schoolwork, and then it became something else. I thought I was the only one, but then I found out about Evan and others. The picture that emerged was one of a man who had lived a double life. Respected teacher by day, predator by night. Stephen had preyed on the insecurities of his students, using their admiration and desire for approval to manipulate them into intimate relationships. The more the detectives uncovered, the more complicated the case became. Evan had clearly been hurt by Stephen's betrayal. But was that enough to drive him to murder? If so, how had he done it? The autopsy report confirmed that Stephen had been poisoned with cyanide. But where had the poison come from? The case had become more complicated than anyone had anticipated, and the detectives knew they were on the verge of uncovering something much darker. With Evan Michaels' confession now on record, the detectives had a motive: jealousy and betrayal, but they still lacked the concrete evidence to prove that Evan had murdered Stephen. The autopsy had confirmed that Stephen had been poisoned with cyanide, but the poison itself was not something easily obtained. The detectives needed to find out how it had ended up in Stephen's tea. Their first lead came from the forensic team, which found traces of cyanide in the tea that Stephen had been drinking the night of his death. The cup itself was clean, no fingerprints, no signs of tampering. Whoever had administered the poison had done so carefully, leaving no trace. The detectives began to investigate anyone who might have had access to cyanide. Their first stop was the school's chemistry lab, where they questioned Mark Davis, the school's chemistry teacher. Mark, a quiet and reserved man in his late 40s, had been friends with Stephen for years and had the knowledge and access to chemicals that could have been used in the murder. When questioned, Mark appeared nervous but cooperative. He committed to being friends with Stephen, but downplayed the closeness of their relationship. "We were colleagues," he said. "I didn't know him outside of work." However, as the detectives continued to press, Mark's story began to unravel. They discovered that he and Stephen had been closer than Mark had initially let on. The two men had been seen together outside of school on several occasions, and there were rumors that their relationship had been more than just professional. The detectives now had two possible suspects: Evan Michaels, the jilted lover, and Mark Davis, the jealous colleague. But without more evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. As they continued to dig into Stephen's life, they uncovered more details about his relationships with his students. Stephen had been involved with several young men, all drawn in by his charm and authority. However, while many of these relationships had been consensual, there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. One of Stephen's former students, Alex Turner, came forward with a shocking revelation. "Stephen was controlling," Alex said. "He made you feel special, like you were the only one. But then, when you weren't useful to him anymore, he'd drop you. I saw it happen with other students too." Alex's testimony painted a picture of a man who had used his position of power to manipulate and exploit vulnerable young men. Stephen's relationships had been built on lies and manipulation, and when those relationships began to unravel, the consequences had been deadly. The detectives now had a clearer understanding of Stephen's dark side, but they still needed to figure out how the cyanide had ended up in his tea. Their breakthrough came when they discovered a small vial of cyanide hidden in a locker at the school. The locker belonged to Mark Davis, and the forensic team confirmed that the cyanide in the vial matched the poison used to kill Stephen. Mark was brought in for questioning again, and this time he couldn't hide his guilt under pressure. He confessed to having supplied Evan with the cyanide, telling him that it was the only way to end his relationship with Stephen once and for all. The confession from Mark Davis revealed the true extent of the deadly love triangle that had led to Stephen Porter's death. What had started as a secret affair between Stephen and Evan Michaels had spiraled into a tangled web of jealousy, manipulation, and murder. Mark, it turned out, had been in love with Stephen for years. He had watched from the sidelines as Stephen moved from one young man to the next, never settling on anyone for long. When Stephen started his relationship with Evan, Mark had grown increasingly jealous. He had seen how much attention Stephen gave to Evan, and it infuriated him. Mark had tried to confront Stephen about his behavior, but Stephen had brushed him off, telling him that he was overreacting. This only fueled Mark's anger, and he began to plot his revenge. It was Mark who had suggested to Evan that the only way to end the love triangle was to eliminate Stephen. He had fed into Evan's insecurities, convincing him that Stephen was using him just as he had used so many others before. Evan, already emotionally fragile, had been easy to manipulate. Mark had supplied him with the cyanide, telling him that it was the only way to free himself from Stephen's control. But when the time came to go through with the plan, Evan couldn't do it. He had left Stephen's house that night, angry and hurt, but unable to commit murder. It was Mark who had finished the job. After Evan left, Mark had entered Stephen's house, using the cyanide to poison his tea. He had taken care to leave no fingerprints, no evidence that could tie him to the crime. But in his desperation to frame Evan, he had made a critical mistake. He had hidden the vial of cyanide in his own locker, a mistake that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The detectives now had a complete picture of what had happened. Mark had used Evan's jealousy and emotional vulnerability to carry out his revenge plot, manipulating the young man into becoming a pawn in his deadly game. As the case moved toward trial, the town of Dover was left in shock. The once beloved teacher, Stephen Porter, was now remembered as a man who had used his position of authority to manipulate and exploit young men. His death had exposed the dark underbelly of his relationships, and the fallout would be felt for years to come. For Evan, the trial would be a chance to tell his side of the story. But for Mark, it would be the end of the road, a road that had been paved with jealousy, obsession, and murder. The investigation into Stephen Porter's death had led the detectives to a dramatic conclusion. Both Evan Michaels and Mark Davis were implicated in the murder. But as the trial loomed closer, it became clear that Mark's involvement was far more sinister than anyone had initially suspected. Mark's confession had shed light on his deep obsession with Stephen, a fixation that had grown over the years as he watched Stephen become involved with various young men. Mark had been jealous of Stephen's ability to charm others and felt humiliated when Stephen chose to pursue relationships with younger men instead of him. During his final interrogation, Mark's calm facade began to crack. The detectives confronted him with the evidence: his connection to the cyanide, the texts and emails that revealed his jealousy, and the forensic analysis that tied him to the murder weapon. Under pressure, Mark finally confessed to orchestrating the entire plan. "I couldn't let him keep doing this," Mark said, his voice hollow. "He thought he could use people, use me, and get away with it. I couldn't let him ruin any more lives." Mark's confession was chilling, revealing the depths of his obsession and how it had twisted his mind. In his desperate need to control Stephen's actions, he had taken the ultimate step: murder. In the end, the trial became a media sensation, highlighting the dangers of manipulation and obsession. As the courtroom listened to the evidence, it became clear that both Evan and Mark had been victims in their own ways, caught in a toxic cycle of jealousy and desire.